Yeah. Okay, so this presentation will be video recorded. Please mute your microphone for the duration of the presentation, so that way, we have very clean presentations. Unmute to ask questions after the presentation end, and also you can actually send us a chat to actually Dr. Samu, who is the moderator, or even myself, to actually ask questions. I think with that, let me just stop sharing, and then I will leave now the floor for Dr. Samu Mogas, who will be moderating this session. Samu?
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Asafa, for making my life easier. You have introduced Mohammed, all of us. Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon. We are living in a different zone. I'm just waking up at 6 a.m. and some of you are living at even 5 a.m. in the western part of United States, and some of you are living in Africa, in Australia, all of you. Good afternoon and good morning. I think the Professor Asafa has introduced Mohammed. I'm not going to introduce Mohammed Basheer. Mohammed Basheer has been in the forefront of modeling. He is a hardcore technical person in modeling and hydrology and whatso in that area. So today, Mohammed would like to present a very pertinent topic, because GERD is going to be filled within a couple of months or weeks. So this is pertinent, especially for Sudan, and he would like to share what's the impact on GERD and what is the way forward and what should be, what does the model show actually. So without going into detail, I'm going to give the floor to Mohammed. Mohammed, are you there? Mohammed?
Yeah, yes, I'm here.
Yeah, please, the floor is yours. As Professor Asafa said, questions after the presentation will give you ample time for presentation, but also give us some time for questions and answers. We have 1 hour in total. You can proceed. You can send questions for me or Asafa, or also you can ask questions directly. But as I told you, Mohammed is a hardcore technical person. I would love if you guys ask questions that are relevant to technical areas. Thank you. You can proceed.
Mohammed, you are a co-host, so.
Yes. All right, can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can see.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Asafa. Thank you very much, Dr. Semo, for having me today. And good morning, good afternoon to the audience, wherever you are. Thank you for being here today. So today I'm going to talk briefly about some potential impacts of the GERD, or the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, on floods in Sudan. And I'm going to use some modeling results as well as some information that we have from the past. I want to start by saying that I do not represent any government in the Eastern Nile Basin, and I do not represent any institution from the Eastern Nile Basin. I'll be happy to answer any question on what I'm going to present, but I wouldn't comment or respond to questions on government positions or government statements. So my presentation will include 6 main points. I will start with a quick introduction, then I will spend a little bit of time talking about the method and the modeling method that I use to assess the impact of floods. Then I will talk very briefly about how the role the GERD played in last year's floods, the 2020 floods in Sudan. We probably we all have heard about that. And then I will show some modeling results on the potential long-term impacts of the GERDs, and then long-term here means after the filling process is over, so that the steady state operation phase. Then I will also show the other side of flood mitigation, which are the environmental impacts, and just very quickly go over them, and then I'll finish with some conclusions. Some background information: the GERD is a hydropower dam located in Ethiopia. Let me get my pointer. Yeah, so the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is located in Ethiopia here, near to the Ethiopian-Sudanese border, and it has a hydropower capacity of 5,150 megawatt. The expected annual energy generation of the GERD when it gets into the steady state operation phase is around 15,000 gigawatt hour, and that will roughly double the current electricity generation of Ethiopia. Some of the characteristics or perhaps challenges that are known in the Nile hydrology is its high interannual variability, as well as its high intra-annual variability or seasonality. So if you look at the top plot here, this shows the year-to-year change in the Nile flow, and here is presented as standardized stream flow index from 1900 to 2002. And we can see that the flow can vary quite a bit, but we can also see that the spells of wet and dry years is increasing. The frequency of drought or flood periods is also increasing, and so this top figure is showing the naturalized flow of the Nile. The figure in the bottom here, this shows the seasonality of the river, and the black line shows the median flow of the Blue Nile at a dam near the Sudanese-Ethiopian border, and that is more or less the amount of inflow that will be coming into the GERD. And we can see that, and then you've got the blue band here. This shows the range within which the river flow varies, and this is based on the flow data of at that location for the period 1965 until 2019. So we can see that the flow can take quite a wide range. It's actually these high flows that cause riverine floods in Sudan. But again, looking at the seasonality of the flow, we can see that around 80% of the flow on average occur in only 4 months in the year, from July to October. Now let's look a little bit about what kind of floods do we have in Sudan, and because that will help us put the impact of the GERD into context. So there are two major types of floods in Sudan: riverine floods and flash floods. Riverine floods happen when the river flow exceeds the carrying capacity of the river channel, and that results in water overflowing to the river banks or the river floodplains, and that results obviously in damage. And there are also flash floods, and these are caused by intense localized rains. And then the riverine floods occur in certain parts of Sudan that are adjacent to the Nile, but flash floods happen almost in all parts of Sudan. So if you look at this map, it shows some Sudanese geography here. The red lines here show the administrative boundaries within Sudan, and the reason why I'm showing this is because normally the number of flood affected people are reported based on these administrative boundaries. So Sudan has 18 states within in the country, so 18 states. If we look at the Nile stream, at the Blue Nile stream, and then the main Nile, we can see that the GERD is going to impact the riverine flood occurrence in 6 of the 18 states in Sudan. And these are the Blue Nile state here, Sinai state, Jazeera state, the Khartoumi state, the River Nile state, and the Northern state. So these are the 6 states that will be affected by the change in the river flow induced by the GERD. If we look at the panel here in the bottom, this shows the percentage of flood affected people in the 6 GERD affected states and in the other 12 states in Sudan. We can see that from this figure, in the majority of the years from 2012 to 2020, most of the flood affected people are actually located in the other states that are not affected by GERD. And this is for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, is because flash floods is also a very common source of flood damage in Sudan. In fact, it's the more common flood damage source in Sudan. But if we look, for example, at years like 2013, where most of the flood affected people were located in the 6 states affected by GERD, if we look at that year a little bit in detail, we can see that most of these people were actually in Khartoum state here, at the confluence. But actually, most of these affected people were also because of flash floods, not because of riverine floods. So here, what I'm trying to say is the GERD is going to have impact on the occurrence of floods in Sudan, but it's not going to end floods in Sudan because there are many causes of floods in Sudan. And in fact, flash floods is a major cause of floods. So to summarize that, Sudan has 18 states, 6 of them will be affected by the GERD, 12 of them will not be affected by the GERD. In the 12 states that are not affected by the GERD, there are flash floods, and there are also riverine floods because there is the Adamasu River, and sometimes also the White Nile, and there are some smaller rivers like the Gash and other small ones that also cause floods. In the 6 GERD-affected states, there are also flash floods, and as I mentioned, in 2013, for example, in Khartoum, most of the flood-affected people were called, were a result of flash floods, but there are riverine floods, and that's what we're talking about. So when we talk about the impact of GERD on floods in Sudan, we're talking about riverine floods in the 6 states affected by the GERD. So there are these other parts, the 4 flood types and in different locations that are not going to be affected by the GERD. Now, let's move on to the assessment method. So how do I do that? How do I assess the impact of floods using modeling? So I use a suite of daily models for a large part of the Eastern Nile river basin. So in the heart of that, there's a river system model. It's a daily model, and I developed it using RiverWare, which is a river reservoir simulation tool that is developed by the University of Colorado Boulder. Yeah, so a river system model is basically a network representation of water supplies and water demands in a river system, and the interaction between these supplies and demands through infrastructures and their operating rules. I also used a rainfall runoff model, and in this case, I use HMS to simulate the inflow of some small streams that are engaged in my river system model. And for that, I mostly relied on remote sensing data for rainfall, evapotranspiration, and topography. And in the case of rainfall data, I did some ground truthing to select which product is more suited for, can predict the observed rainfall the best, and then I use that to drive the rainfall runoff model. Now, there's also a flood inundation model, and this is a quite simplified model based on a tool developed by the USGS. It's called the GIS flood tool. So that tool uses topography data, especially distributed topography data, together with river flows to determine the extent of flood and depth. And yeah, so and to derive that flood inundation tool, I used simulated flows from the river system model. So that means these are the flows after all the infrastructure alteration. So after adding the GERD or without the GERD, and also including all water demands, water supplies, and dams in the system. So I take flows from there, put them into the flood inundation model to determine the flood extent and depth. The river system model can also tell quite a few things. You can learn hydropower, how much hydropower is generated, how much irrigation water is supplied. But I also used it to calculate the number of flood alarms. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. But within the river system model, there are certain locations where there are rating curves, and these rating curves are used to determine the number of days within each flood alarm. The model covers the period so that's the calibration validation period, 1983 to 2017. Yeah, so and then what you see here on the right side is the schematic of the river system model, and it includes 27 inflow nodes. And on the Blue Nile side, it starts from the Ethiopian Sudanese border, including the GERD. And in total, it includes 9 dams in the system, 21 water withdrawal locations, 13 state discharge gauges, and these are quite key to the analysis because they are populated with rating curves, and these rating curves are used to translate river flows to river water levels and determine certain flood alarms. That's in addition to the flood inundation modeling exercise. Again, a very important aspect is that the model includes quite a detailed representation of the system operating rules, over 250 operating rules that describe the daily operations within the system. Yeah, so this is an example for what an operating rule looks like in Riverware. This is a quite simplified one. It could be much more complex, and there are 250 of those just to try to capture all the daily operations in the system. In the left-hand side here, this is a schematic of how the model looks like in the modeling tool. Now let's go back to the stage discharge gauges in the river system. So each stage discharge gauge in the river system model includes a relationship between water level and river flow. So it takes the river flow simulated in the river system model and converts it into water level. And then at different locations in the river system in Sudan, there are certain flood alarm thresholds. So if the water level exceeds a certain level, that's considered a certain threshold. So there are three thresholds used in Sudan: alert, critical, and flooding. And depending on where the water level is, the certain simulated day is considered either it might not have any flood alarm, but it could also be alert, critical, or flooding day. So all the stage discharge gauges in the river system are populated with such kind of rating curves, and these were used, and then the model tracks how many days were in each flood alarm day. And this metric was used later on to indicate how the change in flood occurrence. To have confidence in the model and to start to use it, a calibration validation process was performed, and this was done at 9 locations across the river system using daily observed and simulated flows. And as you can see from this here visually, the model could very well capture the pattern of the observed flows, but also based on some calculated statistical metrics, the mean error percentage, the nice.cliff efficiency, and R-square. And then these metrics were used to rank the performance of the model based on certain criteria published in the literature, and the model showed very good external performance, which gives quite some confidence about the model results. Now let's move on to some results. So that was a description of the method I used. Let's now have a look at, so just so you know, a general description and just going temporarily over the year 2020 and try to understand what happened in 2020 and then what role the GERD played in the 2020 floods. So there are some main periods in 2020. I'm dividing that here into 3 main periods. So here you've got this cross section of the GERD here with which is going to move in a bit, but also I've added this time series or this relationship between days and flows, which is also gonna start animating in a bit. So from January 2020 to July 2020, the inflow to the GERD reservoir was all being passed through their 4 river diversion outlets of the dam. So that means all the inflow was going out through the diversion outlets, and the low block spillway was raised to the level 560. So in that period, all inflow was going out. That means the GERD didn't have any effect of the inflow. So it's a system as if the GERD wasn't there. The diversion outlets were simply passing all the water coming into the reservoir of the GERD. Then we've got the period from July 2020 to July, from July 13th, July 2020. And in that period, first 3 of the river diversion outlets were closed, 1 was operational, and that resulted in the capacity, the amount of outflow lower than the amount of inflow, resulting in an increase in the reservoir water level and a sharp drop in the dam outflow to Sudan. So so here the GERD had a role in reducing the flow in that period, going down to Sudan because the reservoir was filling up. Once the reservoir reached 560, then that's after the 22nd of July, water started to go over the low block spillway, and then the river flow also returned back to normal. So again, in that period, it's a situation as if the GERD wasn't in the system, meaning that all inflow was going out over the low block spillway, except of course for some evaporation and seepage. But in principle, we can say that it is more or less natural flow. Then at some point later on, that one diversion outlet has been closed and all the river flow was going over the low block spillway. Now, what I want to say here is the first period here from the 1st of January to 12th of July, the GERD didn't have any effect on the river flow. And then the period after the 22nd of July until the end of the year, the GERD didn't have any effect on the river flow. The floods in Sudan actually happened in late August to September. That is when we had the damage in Sudan. And that didn't have anything to do with the GERD because the GERD filled quite early in a very short period, very short, intense reduction in flow, and it didn't have anything with the flood peak. There are two quite contradicting narratives out there in the public and the media that the GERD either positively impacted or negatively impacted the floods in Sudan, and both of them are wrong. In my opinion, the GERD didn't have any impact on the flood in Sudan in 2020. Now let's move on to the long-term impacts. So to do that, I examined a couple of scenarios. So I looked at a scenario in which the GERD isn't in the system, and then a scenario in which the GERD is added to the system. So these are two system configurations. And then I examined these scenarios across 34 river flow sequences or traces that have been generated using the index sequential method. So in total, these are 68 simulations. Each of them is 34-year long. My assumption for the simulation was that the GERD is operated to target 38.4 gigawatt hour per day. That's equivalent to 1,600 megawatt. And where I got that number from a publication by Wheeler and others, who found that this is, if you target 1,600 megawatt, that maximizes the 90% power reliability for the GERD. So my assumption is that the GERD is going to be operated for base load and is going to be operated to maximize the 90% power reliability. It's very important to understand and interpret my results in this context, because changing this operational assumption is going to change the results. If the GERD is going to be operated for another purpose, for a purpose other than firm power, then the results are going to change. My second assumption is that there is perfect knowledge in the downstream about GERD releases. This is very important. The Rossino Dam is quite close to the GERD, around 15 kilometers. And the assumption in the model is that any releases, there's just instant knowledge in the simulation model, which allows smooth operation of the Rossino Dam within, considering also the safety of the dam. Another simulation assumption is that the long-term operation of the GERD starts with a storage of around 50 billion cubic meter, and this is more or less the same number in all the GERD filling and operation proposals that are out there. So the simulation starts with this storage, and then the operation of the Rossino Sinara and Merowe dams also have been modified in the long term. So they cannot follow their historical operation, because historically the operation of these dams was designed around the seasonality of the river flow, and that's not going to be the case anymore. So they have to be modified. So my modification for the operation of these dams is that they are operated at high levels, as high as possible, and they only drop to meet the water energy demands. But they do not follow that seasonal pattern anymore. Now let's look at some results. So what you see here is these box plots. These are the impact of GERD operation under the assumptions that I mentioned on the occurrence of the 3 flood alarm levels that I talked about earlier. So we've got alert, critical, and flooding. And each box plot here shows the number of days per year in each of the 3 flood alarm levels. So for example, this panel here shows the annual number of alert days in the baseline, then the annual number of alert days with the GERD. What we can notice from this figure is that the number of days within each of the 3 flood alarm levels decline when the GERD comes in the system, operated to maximize the 90% power reliability and with instant knowledge of downstream flows in Sudan. What's important perhaps to look at here is the Khartoum gauge. So there are 3 gauges here. So I already mentioned that. So there is a dam gauge, and that's located near at the border between Sudan and Ethiopia. There is Khartoum gauge that's located in Khartoum state, on the Blue Nile, very close to the confluence with the White Nile. And then there's the Dongola gauge, and that's located on the main Nile. So these are quite different locations on different parts of the Blue Nile and the main Nile. What I want to take your attention to is the Khartoum gauge and the number and the flooding alarm days. And these are normally the critical days. So we can see that in the baseline, we had a maximum of around 10 flooding alarm days per year, and that declines to only 2 with the GERD. If we look at the percentage of years that had at least 1 flooding alarm day at Khartoum gauge, this percentage was 37% in the baseline, and that declines to around 11% with the GERD. Now, one would ask a question: if the GERD is in the system and is regulating the flow, why do we still have flooding days if the GERD is there, right? Even with the GERD, there are flooding days. Now, if we look at one of the 34 simulated river flow sequences, so here we're looking at the storage of the GERD and the inflow and outflow based on the assumptions for the operating rules of the dam. We can see that due to the high interannual variability of the Blue Nile flow, the inflow to the GERD, the storage of the GERD is going to fluctuate. Sometimes it's going to be high, sometimes it's going to be low during periods of droughts and so on. But then when the GERD level is pretty high, and so the likelihood of having intense downstream releases increases. This is simply because the GERD has a certain capacity, and if it's high and there's high inflow coming in, it has to release water through its spillways for dam safety considerations, basically. And that will result in high flows equal to more or less the inflow to the dam. And these are the periods when those flood events occur in Sudan. We can see that the river system will go through some extended periods without floods, but then you'll get also through some periods with some spikes. Now, what does that mean, especially? So again, so if I go back to this, what you can take from this figure is that the protection of GERD, the protection that the GERD can provide to Sudan depends pretty much on the starting point of the GERD reservoir prior to a major flooding event. If the GERD starts low, then it will have a capacity to absorb the flood event. If it starts high, it wouldn't have that capacity. Now, if you look at that spatially based on the flood inundation model, and here you can see 2 panels. The first panel shows, so here this shows the flood inundation in just 1 year, the maximum inundation area, and that is based on hydrology that is similar to 1988, in which severe floods happened in Khartoum. And this is showing the flood extent for Khartoum state. So that's, you see the dashed line here. This is the Khartoum state. So the 2 panels here, A and B, the first one compares the baseline, which is the red inundation area, so that the GERD is not in the system. And then the blue area here, this shows the flood extent when the GERD is in the system, but starts the year with enough storage capacity to absorb the flood peak. So in that case, the flood inundation area in Khartoum state declines by 68%. So that's when the GERD starts at 595 meters of sea level. So more or less at the minimum operating level. But then you've got the other situation here in which the GERD starts the same kind of hydrologic year, 1988, at 625 meters above sea level. So it has smaller free capacity to absorb the flood wave. And that results in a decline in only 10% of the inundation area. So it's more or less exactly like the baseline. So we need to understand here that depending on where the GERD started at the hydrologic year, the water level, that determines the impact. And so of course, there are other things that can be done, but in principle, from modeling, that's what will happen. Now, in order to start understanding that a little bit and unpack it, let's look at the different components of flood risk. So normally, I mean, typically this is more or less agreed upon. Flood risk has three components: the flood hazard, flood vulnerability, and the values that are at risk. So if we want to manage flood risk, or if we want to bring the flood risk down to zero, what we need to do is to bring one of these three components down to zero, because the multiplication of these three components results in the flood risk. We can bring in the hazard, the vulnerability, or the values at risk, and that results in reducing the flood risk in the riverine flood risk in the 6 states in Sudan. Now let's try to look at what the GERD is going to do. Well, as we have seen, the GERD is going to reduce the flood hazard. So that is the occurrence of flood events, but it's not going to bring it all the way down to zero. All right, so that's going to have a downward effect on the risk. But what is going to happen? What do we expect to happen to the other components? At least the values at risk. My expectation for the values at risk is that they are going to increase, simply because the GERD is going to change the flow pattern in Sudan, and the farmers and population that lived along the river for a very long time, they have their lives centered around that. They have economic activities that rely on the seasonality of the river flow. For example, precision agriculture, that's going to disappear. And if I were a farmer there and precision agriculture is simply going to disappear, I'll start thinking, if I have some resources, some financial resources, I will buy maybe a pump or two. I will dig a couple of canals in my land and start pumping water and irrigating there, right? So I will have a more permanent use of that land for agriculture activities. For farmers who don't have resources, perhaps they will sell their lands to others that have the ability to invest in the land. Perhaps the others will build a house or a nice restaurant on the bank, and so on, right? So that's going to bring more values and put them in the floodplain. So that's a component which is called values at risk. So you're going to bring more permanent values there, like pumps. These are assets, your buildings or houses or other things. So that's going to increase the values at risk, because simply that land is not going to be abandoned. It's going to be used for something else, because historically it has been used for a certain purpose to provide certain economic and social services, and that's going to change. So that's going to increase the values at risk. Now, the aim from flood management is normally reduce the risk. We don't aim to reduce any of these, because these are not the goal. The goal is reducing the risk. Now, of course, the GERD is going to have a positive impact on the flood hazard, but it's expected also to have that impact on the values, and that will result in a different impact on the flood risk. Now, what we need to do to ensure that the risk remains low, either to make sure that we bring down the hazard all the way down to zero. So instead of just reducing it, we bring it all the way down to zero, so that regardless of what happens here, the risk stays zero, or we make sure that the values don't increase. And how do we do that? So there are really very hard choices to be made in the near future. So first, the first thing that needs to be done is coordinating the operation and planning between the GERD and the Rossino Dam. This is even on top of active and daily data sharing. Active and daily data sharing, that's a prerequisite. Without it, there is a safety issue for the Rossino Dam. But with coordinated planning and operation of the GERD and the Rossino Dam, early planning, so for example, at the beginning of the season, if the Rossino Dam would know that the GERD is going to be at a high level, and based on flow forecast, if we know that there's high flow coming in, and the GERD wouldn't have enough capacity to absorb that flood wave, then perhaps the Sudanese authorities could draw down the storage of the Rossino Dam to try to absorb part of that intense outflow from the GERD. which will reduce also the flood hazard. But there are also other things that could be done. There are trade-offs that can be done at the GERD location. It's absolutely there is a choice at the GERD location whether to draw down the GERD reservoir in preparation of a flood wave or to keep it high at the beginning of the flood season. But this is also a very hard choice because you make these choices based on flood forecast. If the flood forecast doesn't come to be true, then that means you're basically reducing the hydropower generation, and that's also a very hard choice to be made on the Ethiopian side. Another thing that can be done on the Sudanese side is trying to raise the public awareness of the awareness of the population that live along the Blue Nile and the Main Nile, by making them aware that the flood hazard is not going to disappear. It's still going to be there, and that they should, the assets that they are going to place there, they should be aware that there is hazard, and there will come time when these assets and values will be at risk, so that they can, prepare for that. Lastly, this perhaps my last slide, I want to talk a little bit very briefly about some potential environmental impact, because oftentimes we talk about floods as destructive phenomena and that bring damage and losses of lives, properties, and livelihoods. But we often forget that floods are just natural phenomena and they bring social, economic, and environmental benefits. Changing the pattern of the Blue Nile flow to Sudan, or we know that the pattern is going to change with the GERD. That's going to have significant environmental impacts. There is an expected change in the oxygen content of in the water, and this is simply because of that high depth of the GERD reservoir and the very deep outlets that will provide water down the stream. So the water that will be coming out of these deep outlets will have lower content, oxygen content compared to natural flow. There is also an expected increase in water salinity, and that's due to an increase in evaporation losses from the GERD reservoir. So when you evaporate water, that will increase the concentration of salts in the water. And so that increase in evaporation is not only from the GERD, but also from the Sudanese reservoirs, the Rossino, Sidar, and Marawi, because their operation will have to be adapted after the operation of the GERD and be operated at a relatively high level. And that will result in further increase in evaporation in the system and increase in water salinity. There's also going to be an alteration to water temperature, and that is again because of the depth, the high depth of the reservoir. And then there's also going to be loss of the floodplains. I mean, when we talk about floods, we're trying to reduce water going to the floodplains, but we always forget that process of water going out to the floodplain is a natural process, and the ecosystem depends on that: birds, fish, and others. So that's going to have environmental impacts. Here I have these plots show some parameters that are going to be impacted by GERD operation. I'm not going to go through them, but I'm happy to get back to them later on if needed. So in conclusion, GERD operation to achieve a 90% power reliability is going to reduce the riverine flood hazard in Sudan. It is one thing, I mean, if there's one thing that I want everyone to take away from this presentation is start to understand the context that we're talking about when we talk about the impact of GERD on floods. So first, we're talking about riverine floods in 6 states in Sudan. Second, we're talking about the impact on the flood hazard. So not the flood risk, not on the values, not on the vulnerability. And again, as I said, this is all contingent on operating the GERD to target 90% power reliability. Changing that is going to change the results. Active daily data sharing is a prerequisite. If we don't have that, there is a big issue in operating the Rossino Dam. How to mitigate the remaining flood risk so that we can try to bring that risk down to zero? First, we can start by seasonal coordination and planning on the operation of the GERD with the downstream reservoirs to have that ability to to involve the downstream reservoirs in that flood mitigation process. We can go further by modifying the operation of the GERD to try and make sure that the GERD is at a lower level when a flood wave is expected to arrive. And then we can also start by raising public awareness on the remaining riverine flood hazard so that they can limit the values that they will place at risk. All these coordination and planning things need to be agreed upon well in advance. We cannot just stumble on them before a flood event is going to happen. And this is going to happen at some point. So it's better to agree on them now and have them in an agreement. We should never forget that floods are natural phenomena that provide social, economic, and environmental benefits. And when we mitigate floods by changing their flow patterns, we're compromising other services that the river system provide. All that I presented today is available publicly in peer-reviewed journals. Please feel free to go through them, and I'm happy to welcome any questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mohammed, for a very elaborate presentation on impact of flood. I think the audiences might have questions. By taking advantage of being a moderator, I would like to comment a few. One is, I think it is misleading to say GERD affected states instead, because GERD, we don't know GERD has any effect so far. So you can, in the title, it says in the legend, GERD affected states. The second and most important comment I would like to make is that any reservoir, whether it starts at lower level or at full level, there is that component of attenuating or reducing floods. So it doesn't mean, even last year when the dam fills up to 560 and overflows, there is that attenuation component. That's always a case in mind. So last year, those flood storage are reduced a little bit of flood hazard in Sudan. And whenever it starts, that's the case, we can refer our hydraulics. So there is that component of reducing flood. Saying that, I think it was a very enlightening and opening for research, especially the last part of this presentation, whether it has impact on oxygen, because, you know, even though the water is released on the down block, there is also that mixing capacity of the rivers. They rejuvenate back. Those are for Ethiopian researchers to continue with this, whether this it has to be validated and come with probably with the same or different resolutions. So I open this for questions and answers. Any question or answers, you can either raise your hands on chat, or you can also voice your voice. I can hear you.
I have some comments.
Okay.
All right. Concerning the July 2020 issue, the 3 weeks of July, that water would have been in the system downstream. So you can start simulation from July 1st, and you can see that holding back 4 billion cubic meter has definitely will have a positive impact for that flooding period, because it is only 3 weeks just before the major high flow started. So my view is it has contributed positively to controlling, to minimizing flood damage. And the second part is, as you discussed, the need for coordination between Sudan and Ethiopia in operation of the dams. This is how we see that there is no legally binding agreement that can cover all these variables. It has to be an initial plan of coordination and go change as you go. So the smaller dams downstream need constant information from upstream. So it's something that you have to coordinate continuously, making changes. So this kind of operational agreements cannot be legally binding just because of their nature. And the other comment on the flood plains is that Sudan needs to do zoning or planning what those areas should be if it is going to be built into structures, then you need a drainage system. Otherwise, with this, with the GERD operation, I think you need a new zoning or planning to control the risk of flood damage. I think that's what.
Okay, you can comment, Mohammed, on this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Quite interesting questions. Perhaps I start with the ones that you mentioned, Semo. So when I say GERD affected states, I don't mean, that's not meant in the past tense, but this is basically the GERDs that are expected to be affected by the GERD. So in short, it's GERD affected states. So that's a little bit of maybe a language issue there. But again, there may be two comments that are quite related to each other from you and from Dr. Rossino as well. You mentioned the impact of the flood on the GERD on flood last year. So just to remind you about how the Sudanese dams are normally operated. In July, August, the reservoirs are normally at their lowest levels. That means that amount of water, if the GERD wasn't there, the amount of water that has been returned in July wouldn't have stayed anywhere in the system because it would have just passed downstream to Egypt. So the reservoirs in Sudan are kept at their lowest level in July, August, and they do not retain any water. So that's why having that retention of water in July wouldn't have any impact on the flood that happened later on in August and September. I agree fully with you that coordination is important, but from my own viewpoint, I don't see any contradiction between coordination and having a legally binding agreement. Again, I mean, that's my own viewpoint. I think you can still have a legally binding agreement that tells you need to coordinate. I don't think these contradict with each other. It's just, I think, a matter of how to formulate that and in a way acceptable to all parties. Yes, again, of course, infrastructure is important to reduce the vulnerability to floods. Of course, if you start building, adding buildings to the floodplains or start using the floodplains more permanently, you need to make sure that, or at least to try to, if there is a feasible way to stop the flood waves, which is going to be very difficult to do, because if you have a high flood that's going to cover the entire floodplain, then I don't think any drainage system is going to take that water away because it's going to just cover the entire floodplain. But again, if there's any kind of levee or any wall that can be built to protect these areas, that would be quite useful. I'll leave it there.
Okay, now I have 3 hands raised and you have to answer 3 in consecutive. One first, Alam Gabriel, and then Dr. Adamasu, and then Tahara. All of them, they will ask you and you can answer after the 3 questions come forward. Alam, you can continue, then Dr. Adamasu, then Sahara Abdullah. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Samu. Thank you, Mohammed, for a very enlightening presentation. I have a couple of questions to you. One is, what's the threshold level flow that really flooding starts between the GERD and Rossino's Dam? That's one of my, in terms of flow, if you know it, or in terms of elevation. That's one question. The second question is regarding your modeling result. You show inflow and outflow graph, the graph you showed. In certain periods, I think there are about 5-6 periods, the flow is close to 0. Can you elaborate on that one? Did you turn off the downstream flow completely? Because during power generation and outflow, there has to be some flow from the dam. So that's the second question I have.
Yeah, you can repeat those questions, okay?
Yeah, that's all I have.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Dr. Adamasu, good to see you. Please proceed with your questions.
I have no question, but I have 1 or 2 comments. First one is, I would like to appreciate those of you who have organized this forum, and it's very important. And the other one is, I would like to appreciate Mohammed, a very young and also very honest. He stayed on the academics. That will help us to create some sort of tradition in the future. because the two countries share the same water. And here is academics. If we talk of things in a scientific manner, and then we'll come to a situation where consensus can be created, because we're all from the same school, same principles. I can tell you this. For example, Mohammed is young, but from his biography, I have learned that he's a student of Professor Barsi. Professor Barsi and myself have been in the same school in Ireland. Simply means that generations to come and so on can work together and can arrive at the same conclusion and keep on doing that. Thank you, Mohammed, and also the organizers. Back to you.
Okay, thank you very much for blessing words. We would like to hear those words as you have been part of this process too. Thank you. Then Sahara, please, you can take the floor.
Okay, thank you for very useful presentation. I'm very interested to get all this information. I'm not engineer, civil engineer. I'm IT engineer, but I hope I get a lot of information about that. I have a questions about Mr. Engineer Mohammed. You mentioned about the 6 states be affected by the grid. There is any relation between the effective and operations these dams or not?
Okay, I think you can answer all these questions briefly. We are running out of time. Probably you answer this question, and we'll give one for Magdala if she appears to have a question. From that, I will stop accepting questions and we would close this session. Go ahead, Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll start with Adam's questions. Yes, there is a threshold for the for declaring a flooding alarm at a dam station that's near the Sudan-Ethiopian border. I think the flow is around 600 millimeter cube per day, but I can check the exact number. I'll send it to you. I've got your email. I'll send it to you after the event. And then you asked about why there are some zero flows, some time steps. So these flows are not zero. These are, so simply when the GERD level goes down to its minimum levels, that means there is no storage anymore in the reservoir. What happens is that the inflow equals to the outflow. And that outflow is simply the natural flow. If you got 10, 20 million, it's going out the same 10, 20 millions, and it appears very small compared to the rest of the flows. That's why it looks like a zero. And then thank you very much, Dr. Adamasu, for your nice words. I really appreciate them. And then to Sahar's question, so there is no relation between the operation of the GERD and the number of states that will be affected, because the river flows in a certain direction, and that flow goes through certain states. So by changing the operation, the number of states that are affected is not going to change. I hope I've got all the questions.
Okay, finally, Magdalawit, please make a brief, your question brief and ask Mohammed. And
Thank you, Dr. Samu. I'll make it brief. First of all, I really want to appreciate your research. It was very insightful, Mohammed. But I want to ask one question. When you were talking about managing the vulnerability of flood, you markedly did not talk about managing vulnerability, right? Which is largely the responsibility of the state, or in this case, that would be Sudan. Considering the fact that a new infrastructure, which was not there, is coming into a shared water course, and that's going to be the new status quo, wouldn't it be actually be better to sort of try to adapt to a new status quo rather than trying to minimize the gap from the baseline of what we're used to, meaning before GERD scenario, right? You only talked about reducing the risk risk, reducing the flooding, which GERD would help with, and also reducing the value of areas around those flood areas. But you markedly forgot to mention or discuss the fact that we can also reduce the vulnerability of flooding that happens in Sudan, which is largely an adaptive measure, and which is largely the responsibility of the state. I mean, GERD is an Ethiopian dam, so you can imagine it would be operated in a way that would suit Ethiopia primarily first. Of course, this is not to say that it has the leeway to cause harm. If there was another country upstream of Ethiopia, I would imagine any benefits coming from that project would be a residual that comes out of the benefit from the country. And I would actually have to adapt in a way the thinking and also the operation in order to adapt to a new status quo, because it is a new infrastructure that is coming into a shared water course. So how do you suggest that these adaptive measures and in your particular research, reducing the vulnerability to flooding can help?
Yeah, Mohammed, how is Sudan prepared to adapt for, because vulnerability is a function of the communities that is there?
Yeah, so thank you. I disagree with the characterization of what's the status quo, because the status quo is basically what's happening now, and there are populations living there. So you cannot really try to manage something that didn't happen yet. So what you're trying to manage and what you're trying to improve is what is going to change. And from my results and my modeling, I've seen that change is not unidirectional. So it's not that the hazard is going to decline. Well, we've seen that, but also the values at risk are going to increase. So the change in flood risk is unknown, right? So that is what you need to adapt to. You don't need to try to think from the end. You start thinking from the beginning and try to adapt to that. And on the vulnerability part, if you've got a floodplain and you're living on a floodplain, or if you have been using that floodplain for agriculture for many years, then when you start changing the use of that land to a more permanent use, that means you're actually affecting the behavior of people downstream. So the impact of reducing the frequency of occurrence of floods doesn't go in one direction. Once the population start adapting their lifestyles, then any flood that will happen will have a larger impact because you've got more values at risk. Of course, I agree with you. If there are any measures that can be taken to reduce the vulnerability, then of course these are very welcome. But these will probably require a large investment, and yeah, and again, I say they are very welcome, and if they can be done, then they can be done.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Magdala's question was, is there any preparedness? Because when we were in the Nile, there was what we call preparedness plans for different countries. I think it's also a message that this country should step into preparing different plans for different scenarios. That's a good suggestion, a good question. I think there are some questions coming, but because of time and institutional, it's streamed from institutions and it started working hours. We have to stop it here. Please communicate with Mohammed. He has this webinar will be on our web, Florida Institute of International Institute of University. You can continue discussing with him. You can also send us questions, then I can also send it to him. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I interrupted you. The discussion was lively. And once again, thank you very much, Mohammed, for your concerted effort to bring scientific issues that are not visible, that are very important for the region, and also important for Ethiopians to consider further and model to save if there is any problem from that side. Thank you very much. I close this session today, and let's see you next time in Alam's presentation by June 27th. Asafa can continue.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Samu. Thank you very much, Mohammed. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming and attending our monthly webinar. It has been very lively discussion and presentations. I would like to again say thank you, Mohammed, for doing this while you are on travel. You have been very positive researchers that you have brought a lot of lights and knowledge to this forum. And as we know, facts and truths are always stubborn. So when we talk about facts, we can converge together. And this is what this forum actually would like to do, bring science and also help the discussions and negotiations. And let's do whatever we can to actually encourage our policymakers and politicians to use science and politics to actually negotiate and also provide policy to make that, GERD is actually multi-country projects that can benefit Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia, and also other countries. So again, next month on June 8th, as Samu said, there's another flood-related presentation by Dr. Alam Gabriel, mainly on the 2020 flood. And Mohammed's presentation was an extended years data simulations, and then next month will be on the 2020, right after the first filling or during the first filling. So please join us again. We will send a reminder. Please join us again. And I hope I will see you next month. If you really think that there are presenters that can provide good information that helps actually the science, please let me know. You can send me an email and then we'll do everything we can to invite. Thank you very much again for coming and attending this webinar. We'll see you next month on June 8th at 8 a.m. Eastern time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah. And this recorded video will be on our website along with the PowerPoint with the permission of Mohammed. Thank you.